This is an overview on working with diverse students and consultation. So we're going to talk for a little bit about the special education referral and decision-making process as it is specific to English language learners. We will later discuss issues related to providing multi-tiered systems of support with English language learners. That is a related discussion. So just some ideas, so if you don't know, there are English language learner terms, and this is kind of important to know that ELL is one option, but you have culturally and linguistically diverse, CLD, and so what would what would the difference really be between ELL and CLD? Well, um, in general, it would mean, if you have somebody from France or Germany, they would be an English language learner, but they may not necessarily also be culturally diverse from more mainstream United States, as seen by diversity being defined as a different from white America, which at this point I'm not sure that it is an uncomfortable term to discuss. Um, just because it, it is it is something that we have to make sure that we are sensitive to discussing. All right, so anyway, English language learner just means they're learning the language. Culturally and linguistically diverse means that they are both culturally diverse and they're learning the language. Um, or they can be linguistically diverse and not be English language learners. They just may be that they are bilingual or trilingual. Anyway, within the world of English language learners, there are a few terms that are used to discuss where someone is in terms of their language learning process. BICS and CALP are the two big ones. BICS is what you need in order for someone to be able to have basic communication. Like, how do I go to the store and ask for what I need? Or how do I just say hey and howdy or get your pen out or things like that? But in order to use language for learning purposes, that has to be CALP. So let me give you kind of an equated in terms of reading. In third grade is when folks switch from learning to read to reading to learn, right? Prior to that, I mean, they can sit there and read to you. And some kids, of course, some kids can read before and understand and whatever. But in terms of what we target in schools, um, you're really kind of getting them to understand the basics of the alphabet and how to read common words that they see all the time, things like that. And that's BICS, right? And then CALP becomes when you can actually, in reading, nobody uses CALP for reading, but whatever. If it were reading, this would have been when the kids can actually pick up the books and read the books to get information. Read a history book instead of just learning to read. So thinking about BICS is on the surface, you may talk to a person and you think, well, this person is fluent because they have no accent and they can talk to me and have this casual conversation, and they may not have CALP. By the way, whether or not you have an accent is mostly determined based off of whether or not you've hit puberty. Pre-puberty, if you learn a new language pre-puberty, you tend not to have an accent. So you can sound fluent, but not actually have the language that you need. On the other hand, you can have a thick accent, but speak perfect English. In that you know all the words and you have CALP. Now CULP is its own thing. So remember, when we're talking about English language learners, oftentimes we're talking about folks who already have another language. So the idea is that you first learn your first language, whatever that first language may be, and you get CALP in that language. And then everything after that becomes basically kind of a translation in your head. Between the two languages. CULP is where your knowledge of what language is and how do I ask for things, what is nonverbal body cues, what all those things that have to do, it's not a translation, it's intrinsic, right? At this point you completely understand it. You're not trying to translate one word to the other. This is kind of at your foundational understanding. And, of course, we want as much culp in both languages as we can get. And so L1 is always the first language, L2 is the second language. Just something else to keep in mind is that you have to have CALP in one language before you can get CALP in a second. Something else to keep in mind is a lot of folks who come from Spanish-speaking countries and Spanish is the dominant language, that may not be their language. So for instance, there are 80 independent languages, not dialects, languages in Guatemala alone. Over 100 spoken in Mexico. And so, they come here and you say, oh, hey, this person is Mexican, they must speak Spanish. Oftentimes Spanish is their second language and English becomes their third language. So just keep these things in mind when you think, oh, this person is, bilingual, is not bilingual. Yeah, they may be. You may be trying to push a third language on them, and then where does CULP fall and all that? One other thing, anytime you give a test in a language that the individual doesn't speak, it shifts from being a test of, math or read alphabet math tends to be alingual, but whatever. Or, it ceases to be a test of reading or IQ or something like that and becomes instead a language proficiency test. Okay? So just keep that in mind that the validity of a test is what gets affected when you give it in the wrong language. You're not testing what you think you're testing. You think you're testing IQ, but what you're actually testing is their English language skills. There are several types of ways that children learn a new language. Bilingual education types tend to fall within this sort of range. Immersion is that sink or swim. We just throw them in, they figure it out. ESOL or TESOL or ESL, all three of those are kind of the same thing. They use something called TPR, which is total physical response. They do not teach the child any in their native language. It's all English with body motions and things like that that indicate to the child what is desired or what's needed. Then there's transitional and maintenance. Those are they're very similar to one another. It's where you teach the child for a little while in their native language, overlapping it with English until you completely phase out their native language and only speak in English, only work in English. What's the difference between them? How long you spend teaching them in their native language. Dual language is where you teach both languages 50-50. So some schools, the way they do this is that first grade is in English, second grade is in Spanish, third, grade is in English, fourth grade is in Spanish. So they sometimes do it by grades. Sometimes they'll do it by classes. They'll say you have 6 periods a day, 3 of them are going to be in English, and 3 of them are going to be in this other language. And in addition, dual language, they will try and have 50-50 in the school. So 50% of the children who start out there only speak English, and 50% of the children who start out there only speak whatever is the target language. And so by the time they all finish, both groups are bilingual in both languages. So restoration, that is where this tends to be more something that happens with adults or even adolescents who maybe their grandmother spoke Greek and now they say, well, I want to learn how to speak Greek. So they go and they take Greek classes so that they can speak the language of their ancestors. And then enrichment, that's like Spanish 101 and Spanish 102 or whatever. It's just learning language without the intention necessarily of ever learning how to be fluent, but more about just learning language. So which of these bilingual programs work the best? So just kind of pay attention. This is from the Thomas and Collier study in 1997. I know that at this point it seems a little dated, but remember, they did this with longitudinal data over 12 years with multiple programs. I don't see it being redone anytime real soon. But just for you to kind of get a chance to see, all kids in kindergarten started out at the same place. So you can see that with the lines. I know the lines are really light, but still you can see that they all started in the same place wherein that all the kids fell around the 20th percentile. So these kids for whom English is not their first language, they tended not to be in the average range on the tests that they were given. Okay. And this, I think, was just a general aptitude test. All right, so let's keep going. Let's look at the TESOL group, which is the very first group. That's the bottom group, is just all they got was the TPR. They got nothing in their first language. They go up to 30th percentile around 5th grade, and by the time they get to the end of high school, they tend to be in the teens for percentile rank on this test. So what we find is TESOL is not like that. That is the average percentile rank for kids who are getting TESOL. The next two are early exit 1 and early exit 2. Those are that transitional and maintenance that we were talking about. They get a little of the language of their first language and then they're transitioned out. So you'll notice with those two groups, those kids kind of spike a little earlier. They do much better than the TESOL group. And then, their baseline tends to be 25, 35% by the percentile by the time they get to high school. So they do better than TESOL alone, than sink or swim, but they don't do as well as those who get late exits. So a late exit is one of those where really the kids get support in both languages for quite a long time. And those kids tend to get to the 50th percentile by high school. They may dip a little bit lower than the average by the time they graduate, but if you give them support in their native language and in English, they're doing great. But who does the best? That dual language program. Take a look. The kids who are going to the dual language, this is where they learn 50% of their time in one language and 50% of the time in another. By 7th grade, they're at the 50th percentile. So they're doing as well as everyone else, non-English language learners, folks who already speak English. But by the time they get to 12th grade, they're over 60th percentile. So the average for these kids that get the two-way programs, the dual language programs, their average ranking goes up 10 percentile higher than the average student who is not an English language learner. So clearly, what type of English language learning program you're placed in has a huge difference in terms of your overall academic outcomes. Ideally, we would place the kids, all of them, in the two-way programs, and nobody would receive TESOL, but this is the government, the U.S. government, determined that these are all treated equally, and so it is not considered a lack of educational opportunity if you've received any one of these. Now, not receiving anything at all might be considered lack of educational opportunity, but if you've had any one of these, then that's not the problem. So when you are trying to decide where the child should be in terms of language proficiency, it's not just enough for you to know that he's got some sort of bilingual ed program. What bilingual ed program? And how long has it been? Just as an aside, kids who come from another country in 6th grade or 7th grade, and so they've been to school in that other country, and then they come here, and they were attending a good school of the other country, and they come here, those kids do a lot better than the ones because they already have CALP in their first language. So they've had a chance to get CALP in their first language. So at this point, they're just translating the skills into English. Those kids do a lot better than the kids who start off with TESOL or early exits. So just to keep that in mind. So this is the special education referral process, and this is really important for you to understand the whole thing. Usually the first step up here in the top left-hand corner, the teacher starts to be concerned, or for some reason the child is referred. Limited English proficiency, that is another one of these acronyms. So there might be a committee specifically set aside for English language learners. And that's because when I hear a teacher concerned, this child is not improving as fast as I would want them to, if that person is one of the bilingual ed teachers, then I'm much more worried about this child than if it's a gen ed teacher, especially a gen ed teacher who's never worked with a population of children for whom English is not their first language. So then in general ed, we're going to start some of those pre-referral stuff, some of the child study team stuff. We're going to start monitoring their progress. And then the next thing is at the child study teams, we're now looking at the response to intervention. And if the child has failed to respond to the intervention, then the child is probably going to be referred on to a bilingual assessor. And then the test and instruments and all that stuff is going to be going on during that next phase. And then special education, least restrictive environment, parental involvement, language and culture, those are all going to be things that you have to consider during special ed. So you'll notice at several points there are consultation meetings taking place. At phase 2, when you have the child study team, phase 3, when you have the child study team, and phase 5, when you have the staffing meetings. And so these all require an understanding of how to work with this population and what their needs are. Because remembering who's a part of these team meetings, if they're over 14, it may be the child. Often it's the parents, and then you're going to have the gen ed teacher, and by stage 5, you'll have a special ed teacher. And then in addition to that, you're going to have maybe the bilingual ed teacher there as well. So one of the other, just an aside with diverse students, be they English language learners or any group, we do know that there is what's called a disproportionality. So what happens with disproportionality? Okay, so it's not say, well, there's just more black kids in special ed. The question becomes, more black kids than what? So if you have a school that's 95% African American and the special ed program is 95% African American, that's not disproportional, that's proportional. The concern comes when you have a school that's, say, 95% African American and 99% of the special ed program is African American. Or if you have a school that's 30% African American and 50% of the special ed program is filled with students who are African American. And then this divides out even more, remembering that there are 13 categories of special education, and then we can add gifted ed as well. We have found that disproportionality doesn't just happen where you find that there's a disproportionate number, either too high or too low, of individuals in special education as back to the population in school. But certain areas have higher overrepresentation than others. So the big ones for African Americans tend to be that you'll see them overrepresented in what used to be known as mental retardation is now intellectual disability. You'll see them higher, a disproportionate representation in developmental delay, speech language, etc. Native Americans across the board. Hispanics, students tend to be overrepresented in specific learning disabilities. And that particular one has a lot to do with giving tests in English and then saying, well, they couldn't do it. Well, they couldn't because you gave them the wrong one. You have an overrepresentation of Asian Pacific Islanders in autism and hearing impairments and deaf blindness. You also have an overrepresentation of Asians in gifted education programs as well. So the big issues really have to do with the overrepresentation of African American students in ED classrooms, emotionally disturbed, and in MRID classrooms, mental retardation and intellectual disability. So the question becomes, how does that work? And part of this has to do with the assessment, the nature of the assessments, that we do have bias in our tests, but the biggest part is who's referring these kids. So 90% of kids who are referred within some sort of child study team then go on for testing, and most of those kids that get tested are then found eligible for services. That's why consultation is so important, because one of the reasons the overrepresentation happens is that the teacher refers the child, and then they get to the psychologist, we do the assessments, and we tend to go towards more false positives than false negatives. And by that I mean, I think we put more kids in special ed and say that they have a disability. Well, we don't put them in special ed, the school puts them in special ed, but we'll recommend that this child has a disability and they mean special ed services more so than not. And so working with teachers on the front end, making sure that they're setting up systems in their schools that are designed for these diverse populations, that's the way to keep the disproportionate numbers more equal. You know, the research shows most teachers are white and female, and white female teachers over refer, particularly black male students, more than any other group. So remembering that there's all these different kind of teams, we've talked about these teams before, hopefully, and you have the original set of teams there, the child study, those are the pre-referral kind of teams. The child is English language learner, you must include some sort of bilingual or TESOL teacher as part of the child study team for that kid. For the eligibility teams and deciding if the child has a disability, you need to have hopefully a bilingual specialist and maybe a bilingual school psychologist. You're going to have some sort of translator, and you really should have a TESOL and bilingual ed teacher there as well, but they're not required. And in the IEP teams, this is where you're determining not that the child has a disability, you've already determined that at the eligibility team, but what services are we going to put on the IEP? Again, you should have a translator there, which is not listed here, but you should, and you should have a bilingual ed teacher. So what are some of the problems with teams? Well, parents are less involved, and we're going to spend a little bit more time on that, but parents are less involved than they're supposed to be. A lot of times it's the school psychologist that makes a lot of the eligibility decisions, and the special ed teacher who makes the IEP decisions. How these decisions and data are collected and all that change very dramatically from district to district and sometimes school to school. And this is problematic if you have migrant populations that move from district to district several times a year. So data did not indicate that bringing a team together ensured the most appropriate decisions. So sometimes teams don't make the right choices. And sometimes part of this has to do with whether or not you're collaborating with each other, or if you're trying to fight for more dominance, and then, so for instance, you have the gen ed teacher who doesn't like this child and wants them out of their classroom. So they're fighting to get this child as many special ed hours as they can. And you have the special ed teacher who doesn't want the kid either. So you could end up with a situation where you do not have collaboration. So what are some problems, again, with English language learner teams? So those are general problems with teams. What else do we have? A lot of times these teams will want to wait and wait and wait. We can't refer this child yet. He doesn't speak English. And that's not right. If you think a child has a disability, you're supposed to go ahead and refer them. And when are they ready to test? You're ready to test as soon as you think that the child has a disability. And if they're not proficient in English, well, then you test them in the language that they are proficient in. And then there's this lack of understanding between the difference between lack of English proficiency or a disability. And then within all of these eligibility choices, we like test data because it feels more scientific, and in some ways it is. But when we're talking about kids who are different than the normative group that the test was designed for, that is when the test scores are less valuable and therefore should be not as weighted as heavily. So this gives you kind of an idea of what this looks like. When an English only student tests data on the left-hand side, you can see it's a big deal. You spend a lot of time thinking about tests. And other things like records, observations, interviews, those things are important, but they're not weighted as much. This changes when you have an English language learner student, in that records and observations become so much more valuable in your diagnostic decisions. And tests are still a part of it, but they're not nearly and should not be weighted nearly as much in that decision. But who's the most important member of the eligibility team? It tends to be the school psychologist. And so it's so important that you guys understand this process of how kids are referred, the fact that we tend to over-identify kids, and that this is actually the way that we're supposed to be using data. So what about parents? Why aren't parents the most important voice there? A lot of times the parents don't know anything about the IEP process. They just show up to a meeting, they have no clue. Sometimes the professionals don't have any idea how to include the parents. They just do things the way they always did. Oftentimes parents will feel intimidated. They're worried things that, well, if I speak out, or if I say anything inappropriate, then they will take it out on my kid, is what they worry about. And then a lot of times Hispanic parents don't understand that they have a legal right for their kids to be there, so they may feel like, if I say anything, if I rock the boat, they'll kick my kid out. You have other issues. Parents sometimes can't even make it to the meeting because they may not be able to get babysitting. If the school's not on some sort of bus line, they may not even be able to physically get there. And then, of course, you have, just alone in this presentation, I've done ELL, LEP, CLUP, all these different things, IEP. Parents may not understand the jargon. They, not only do they not understand the language because they may not speak English, they don't understand the jargon either. So then we have problems with schools and English language learner parents. School personnel will make negative comments about the families before and after the meeting. I'm going to get back on that in just a second. We have terrible translation services. People are just unprofessional behind what they should be doing. A lot of insensitivity, and they want to do things on their schedule. And parents may not be available during school hours because they may have a job, and they may not have time that they can take off from their job to deal with these kinds of issues. And if you have multiple meetings each year, one for the occupational therapist, one for the speech language pathologist, one for eligibility for this or that or the other, and IEPs, and you could have a parent, you're asking them to take off a week or two each year just to deal with these educational concerns and be at these meetings that they don't have a voice in anyway. If you're going to make it required that they be there, you have to be there for them. So I'm going to give an example. There was a meeting once that I was in as the translator. I wasn't there as the school psychologist. I was there as the translator, and I don't even remember why at this point. And we were sitting around the table, and I was there to, that was all I was supposed to do, was just translate. And this one teacher, when they were giving their status, how's the kid doing? How's the kid doing? How's the kid doing? Get to the teacher, and she says, I'll tell you, that girl's just a fat little heifer. That's what she said in front of the mom of the meeting. And then she looks at me and she said, don't translate that. Well, I'm not allowed to not translate that. I'm supposed to translate that. Two things. Even if mom doesn't know what fat little heifer is, she could tell from the teacher's face and tone that it was negative. Second, I could have said that this little girl is like heifer is a female cow, maybe, but it doesn't have the same meaning and the ugliness of it. So luckily I didn't know how to translate fat little heifer into Spanish, but I tried to portray the teacher is unhappy with this kid in their classroom or something like that. And that's me knowing what I'm doing. I was very uncomfortable with the situation. I had to talk to the teacher later about it, again as a translator. And then, think about this. What if I had been someone who was a member of the family or a member of the family's community, and then I was the translator? So, what do we do? What happens? So I'm going to talk about, this was actually an article that came out of my dissertation, so it is quite old at this point. Because what happened was that I was working in a school district where, and I feel like this has been the worst job in the world, that there was a gentleman whose job it was to attend every IEP meeting and eligibility meeting. That's all he did. He was the LEA, the lead educational advocate, and he went from school to school to school to school. making sure that he was distributing the services and he knew exactly which schools had which options and how many slots they had available, et cetera, et cetera. And if you wanted to hold a meeting, you had to call him and say, hey, I want to hold this meeting on this day. And when you called him, you got a secretary or an office administrator because he was out in the field. And she held his calendar. And you call and you'd say, I need to schedule this meeting. And she would say, what color? I said, what do you mean, what color? If the child was white, they got 2 hours. If they were anything else, they got half an hour to an hour of her time. I was horrified. I was like, this is not okay. You know, the very families, if you have a translator, it's going to take twice as long anyway. The very families who needed additional time were not given additional time. And when I challenged her and later challenged him on it, they said they don't ask for more time. If I booked it, they wouldn't use it anyway. So I book my time based off of what my past experiences are. If they want more time, we'll schedule it and I'll come back. So when the time came for me to do my dissertation, I was wanting to know, how do these parents feel? Do they feel like they are getting less than other families? Do they feel like they're getting sufficient time during these meetings? What do we know? So in doing this, we looked at first, what are some, the parents' perceptions of these IEP meetings? What was keeping them from these meetings? Well, they had jobs, they have other kids, and they had no child care. If the child was in middle school or high school, they might have been less likely to go. They may not have realized they were supposed to be there to begin with. They may not have any idea what these meetings are about. The parents may not have any idea what the school may have had a little idea about what the parents are about. Of course, the communication problems. School climate, or those parents feel welcome? Is there some sort of feeling of intimidation or disconnection? So there were some false beliefs held by the parents and by the schools. The parents, when they ask, you say, yes, I have my AP right here. And the school knows what's best for my child, so I just need to agree with the school. They didn't really know how to be a part of the meeting, and they didn't really understand that they were supposed to be a part of the meeting. And they didn't realize they could get more. And then in a lot of cultures, it's just rude to disagree. On the other hand, the schools thought the parents knew what their rights were because they were saying yes. And the school agrees. Yes, we know what's best for your kid. They'll say, well, parents don't even want to be here. And they don't ask for more, so they're not going to get more. And so since they're not going to ask for more, they must agree with what we're saying. And so you see these two false groups, one being the school saying, we know what's best, and we're going to just do it since mom and dad don't care. And mom and dad care, but they don't understand that they have the rights to change what's happening for their child. Let's see. So all of these different things, the district has explained special ed services and education. In elementary school, families felt like that was absolutely true. High school, it was worse. Written notices are given to me in a timely manner. The white families were saying, no, 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 I don't get what I need. The Hispanic families were saying, absolutely. Opportunities for communication with my child's principal and teachers. Again, elementary school, 1 out. IEP had the appropriate goals and objectives. Elementary school, 1 out. IEP included the special education services the kid needed. Elementary school, 1 out. And the child's IEP included information about how to evaluate child's progress. Elementary school, 1 out. And then this last one, the school is providing the services I believe my child deserves. White families were saying, no, no, my kid deserves better. Hispanic families were saying, no, no, the school's doing an excellent job. For the most part, parents were happy with their roles. So this data actually supports what that man said to the man who held all those meetings. When I went to him and I said, you need to give them more time, he said the Hispanic families or the other families do not want more time and they wouldn't use it and they're satisfied with what they have. And the white families took up a lot of his time because they expected more. Now, this is just about perceptions. Are you happy? Are you not happy? This is not saying that this is accurate. What happens is the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So the white parents who are saying my kid gets more and needs more, those kids get more. And so you end up with, from the very beginning, the parents are getting less time in these meetings, but then also the parents are pushing for fewer supports. They're pushing less for additional supports. And so because they don't know they can have more, they don't get more. And as we talked earlier, kids, particularly the ones who are linguistically different, actually need more. So this is highly problematic. So this is a terribly looking slide, but I do like this to show a shift that parents used to blame their kids for schools, poor grades, because they believed 100% that the school was doing what they're supposed to. But now the parents will push it onto the teachers. The teacher's fault that the kids are not performing as well. And this is because parents are feeling more empowered. White parents are feeling more empowered to take on schools and demand more. So here's just a set of additional reasons why kids may have some school problems. Some of these I might have touched on before. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. This is the kind of thing you can read through on your own. I know you've seen this slide before just because I absolutely love this, but these are the reasons kids fail. Poor motivation, lack of practice, not help doing it, instructional demands, poor match, and then child has a disability. So the lack of opportunities to do it and the poor motivation, those are the ones we're going to talk a little bit now. So you do have emotional problems. About 12 to 30%, and this is in 1998, of students in the US have some sort of severe, serious emotional problem. Internalizing disorders, sadness, anxiety, or shame, versus like anger, frustration, and aggression. Okay. So we do know that when kids have things like test anxiety, I'm not even going to come to class. If they're depressed, they have problems with finishing their homework and missing class. Anger can lead to withdrawal or social issues in the schools. And sadness and anger are both linked to lower GPA. And so this is really important, that the emotions a child has may affect the motivation and their performance. That being said, there has been this theory that emotional problems lead to academic problems, and academic problems and then lead up to emotional problems. And in fact, there was a hypothesis of this. For you guys that know structural equation modeling, you can't actually do this reciprocal its way, but whatever. That all of these were related to one another. That as your attitude goes up or down, your academics go up or down. All three of these are related. So I want you to take a second and then decide if you think that this is correct or if you think that there are ones that are more true or not. All right, welcome back. Here is the model that we studied when we were doing this. We did this research. We wanted to see whether or not we did have an interconnected relationship. And what we found was we didn't. What we found was that motivation leads to behavior. So kids that are more motivated are more likely to have good behavior in school. And then we saw that there was a reciprocal relationship between achievement and motivation. The higher the motivation, the higher the achievement, and the better they're doing in school, the more motivated they are. So that says at a consultative level, if I want to influence all three of these, behavior, attitude, and academics, what one thing should I target? That's attitude, my motivation. If I can increase the kids' motivation to learn or a school's academic motivation to learn, then I can affect both the behavior and the academic performance of the children, which is really cool. But we're doing things to kill motivation all the time. When we decrease physical education time or recess, when we take away their lunch time, when we require kids to do more and do better, when we take away art and music and all these things that the kids value as being motivation for them to feel connected to the school. Those things, when they're gone, what's left is poor motivation, and that is really hard to get back. And we can see that that affects both sides. There is also something called a slow learner. Slow learner, prior to the 1950s, we had the three categories of mental retardation: moron, imbecile, and idiot. Um, and then in the 1950s, we switched to these mild, moderate, severe, etc., profound, and we had borderline. Borderline intellectual functioning was 83 to 67. This all shifted to being more like 70 and below was intellectually disabled. So 70, um, so 70 and above, depending on how you looked at this. So 70 between 70 and 80 was considered and had a diagnosis of borderline intellectual functioning. So you were either intellectually disabled, you were average, or even a little below average, or you were borderline intellectual functioning. It's that group between basically 71 and 83 that we call slow learners. So right now, this is what this looks like: borderline intellectual functioning, 71 to 84. Slow learner diagnosis, they're kind of working at their potential. This is a kid who gets C's, but that's as good as they're going to do. It's not a learning disability, doesn't really meet a special ed requirement, but they're expected to perform at the same level as everybody else, even though their IQ is not low enough for them to have an intellectual diagnosis, an intellectual disability diagnosis, and not high enough really for them to have a learning disability diagnosis. Now, in the DSM, they now can get a learning disorder diagnosis as long as any of their achievement scores are below 85. But back in the day, slow learners, they were working at their potential. So where did they go? Well, they go into regular ed. Even the kids who get a learning disorder diagnosis outside of the schools, they're going to only be able to get a 504 plan, because if they don't have a learning disability diagnosis, the way the school says they have one, they can't get special ed. So even though they're in gen ed, that means they have to pass all the high school graduation tests, they have to pass all the classes. So what happens? A lot of times IEP teams will use a professional judgment. Those kids that are 72 or 73, they'll go ahead and pop them down to an intellectual disability. Or the kids that are over 80, they might pop them into a learning disability. And so that professional judgment, that's where the second place where a lot of this overrepresentation happens. Because what we find is professional judgment results in African Americans being pushed into the ID classroom and white students being pushed into the learning disability classroom. And these are kids with almost identical profiles. So the question becomes then, if we're going to go ahead and do this, we take these slow learners and we put them in special ed and we put some of them in gen ed, which do the same and which do better? So I want you to take a minute and write down which of the ones of these you think. You have three options: same, better, worse. The kids that are in SPED, do they do better in terms of is SPED better than regular ed and absenteeism, or is it the same? So pause and do that. All right, welcome back. Here's the results. A lot of these, there's no difference. So we use our professional judgment, we shove the kid into special ed, and we find that a lot of these early things are not any different. And in fact, and a lot of times, in reading and math grades overall, the kids that are not getting special ed actually do better. So, and the ones who are not in special ed are more likely to pass the high school graduation exam. Why? That's because they're actually attending the gen ed classroom. They are in their least restrictive environment, and so they're getting exposed to all of the topics that are covered in the high school exam. And so the one area where special ed does a little better is in elementary school math. So when you're thinking, well, the teacher's like, we need to put this baby needs help, you need to put this baby and give him help. Placing a slow learner into special ed does not actually help them. All right, and then there's some health causes. Some are voluntary and involuntary. I don't love those terms, so we'll keep going. We do know that drug use is a big part. Remembering that drug use, it does kill children. And kids actually do use drugs, and a lot of them are binge drinking. So I'm going to let you kind of go through this set of slides, but you know, when you're working with kids, you have to remember sometimes it's emotional disability and sometimes it's this. So sometimes you set up drug and alcohol programs. Maybe it's something that you're going to have in your high schools and something that you may have to work with your teachers on how to identify kids that are using versus abusing and who need additional help. So in addition, when you're trying to make a diagnostic decision about these kids, just remember about drug use and how it mimics a lot of other issues. Child abuse, huge consequences for child abuse, lots and lots and lots of issues. Leads to this could actually lead to brain development and brain development issues. So if you're in a constant state of toxic stress before you even start school, birth through 5, then you may actually have your experiences in life, you may actually have had brain damage caused by this, even if they never actually hit your head. Okay. So it's very important that we're a part of this. It's one of the reasons I make you guys do training in this area. And so what about it? Well, ACEs is a study about adverse childhood experiences. So they asked men and women who were grown whether or not they experienced any of these types of abuse. And you'll see, it's kind of interesting to see the total, but like emotional abuse, women were much more likely to receive it, whereas physical abuse, men were more likely to receive it. Sexual abuse, more women. Again, maybe it even just that more women report it. And you go down through, and then there's household challenges, neglect, and things like that. And on the ACEs scale, the more ACEs you have, the more of these things that you say happen in your life, the more at risk you are. And you'll see that about 10% of all people report, actually it's even higher than that, it's about 20% of all people report having 3 or more ACEs. That is so high when we know the risks that this can have. Illness, we have real problems with kids not having insurance. And when they are insured, they're underinsured. So a lot of kids have, about 41% of kids 0 to 17 were on public coverage. What is that? Medicare, Medicaid, right? About 5% are uninsured. And we know that a lot of the underinsured stuff are dental and optical care. Vision, hearing, those kind of things. Even it says vision, hearing can cause academic problems, so can teeth pain. And so you have to make sure that that all children, that some sort of illness issue is not part of why they're struggling, and then work to see the best you can to get them services. And then some systems causes can be the environment, socioeconomic status of the school is one of the main predictors of child success. And then what's going on with the peer group? Are they welcoming of these kids? Are they not? Teachers, etc. So you guys have seen the Bronfenbrenner model. And then there's this idea of acculturation. So when asked what are the most stressful life experiences, these are the things, death in the family or death of yourself, injury, illness, getting a new family member, and that could be, your mom has a baby. It can also be grandma moves in, something like that. Change in work or living conditions, change in residence, school, church, sleeping, and eating. These are very stressful experiences. And a lot of these things happen, change in church, school, sleeping, eating, getting additional family members, etc. A lot of these things happen when you are migrant, when you move from one place to another, change in work, about half of these, if not more, are included with kids that are frequently moving or acculturating. So, if you move and you have a dramatic change because your family moved from another country to here, then all of a sudden this list grows very, very long. Especially if you moved here because you were a refugee. You may have injury, illness, marital separation. Maybe one parent could come here with you and the other one couldn't. I mean, you could have 100% of these easily. So acculturation by itself is pretty stressful. Many of you have moved at some point in your life. So you may have experienced this acculturation W, where you first move there, you're like, hey, this place is really cool at the top of the W. I'm like right there. And then you slide down the left-hand side to the bottom of the V, at the first V. And you're like, oh, this is the worst. I miss my home. I miss my friends. I miss my food. I miss the climate. I miss the weather, etc. And then things get a little better. And then you have, just as a wave pattern like depression, you're going to see peaks and valleys of, okay, so it's okay here. No, I'm really unhappy here, until it finally evens out. And so this this W mimics depression and anxiety. Oftentimes, there's other issues associated with this, and we will spend more time if you take the diversity class with me in the fall. Um, but we do know that as you become more bicultural, and that means as you become more acculturated into the system that you live, social and emotional problems do go down. But the process of acculturation is really painful. So if you have other kids, they come from other countries, what were their systems like before they get there? So you ask mom, you say, oh, mom, did he go to school when he was somewhere else? And so you see here in Honduras, yeah, maybe they went to school, but this may be what the school looks like. I actually got a chance to tour. This is not a picture I took, but this was very similar to a school I toured when I was in Roatan, Honduras. And all kids were together, kindergarten through 12th grade. They had a chalkboard. That was it. Um, and the kids came when they could. So it's not 180 school days. Not every single place has exact same experience. Now, I will say, if mom says, yeah, he was in school somewhere else and he was struggling there too, that is a red flag to me. And then in some countries, we still have segregation. Maybe the boys can go to school and the girls can't. Or maybe different ethnic groups or racial groups or religious groups can and other groups can't. So within the United States, we do know that there's differences depending on where you go to school here in the United States. And even within the same state, I'm from Alabama, and Alabama and 3 other states always fight for the lowest possible ranking every year. And that's a very different, so I had a very different schooling experience than, say, someone who's from Massachusetts, where they have very high ranking schools. And so, but we do have, so for instance, the state of Alabama, my stepbrother and stepsister and I, for about a year or two, went to a school district that is in the top 10% of the nation, Mountain Brook City Schools. And so with that in mind, you have Alabama, which as a state is one of the lowest performing education-wise, with one little district in it where the funds are so high because it's so wealthy that it's within the top 10% of the country. So just remembering this. And then again, not all private schools are better than public schools. You also have this idea, and this is Ogboo's theory. You may like it, you may not. There's so much controversy around this, so I just put the theory out there. But there are people who come here because they want to acculturate faster than folks who don't. And I say acculturate faster in that it may be multi-generational acculturation. So the involuntary immigrant is someone who came because they were refugees, someone who came because they were slaves. They were, a bunch of different reasons. A lot of times the involuntary group will tend to stay together and not seek out to become integrated into the bigger society. So I can only use the family that I come from. So my family came over as involuntary immigrants because my family came over in part because of the Great Potato Famine in Ireland. And so you saw that. They came over and they stayed in Boston and they stayed in New York. A lot of the Irish folks stayed in the northeastern part of the United States, and you can still see that. And a lot of them never left. And a lot of them still hold a lot of the pride in being Irish and a lot less acculturation, even multiple generations down. Now, my family, they left that part of the country and came down to other parts of the country, the southeastern part of the United States, where being Irish is not such a part of the identity that biculturalism was able to grow. The other group of people are the ones who come because, hey, the United States is amazing and I want to come here because I can do so much more. That group tends to want to become more bicultural because they want to be like this place that they love before they even got here. And therefore, that ends up with more sense of freedom and sense of success. Believe it, don't believe it, go with it, don't go with it. I'm just putting it out there what the theory is that knowing why, multi-generationally why families came may or may not influence how they do in schools. There is a good book that sort of supports this with the Irish potato famine called The Great School Wars, which looks at the Irish population moving over here. And not only, and then that becomes the founding, because they didn't want to acculturate, it becomes the founding of the Irish Catholic school movement. Poverty, I do want you to take a moment and look at ACEs and poverty, this little video. It's about 4 minutes long. Before you do that, just take a look at the list on the left-hand side of things that happen in poverty. And so a lot of times people will talk about culture and ethnicity, and what they really mean are, it's not culture, ethnicity, it's poverty that's causing these problems, not ethnicity, race, etc. So do pause, take a look at this video, and if you can't access it through the PowerPoints, here's the link is at the bottom. Okay, welcome back. I want for you guys in your groups, now this would be individual work now, what are the exclusionary clauses? What are some ways to determine if these clauses apply to a particular child? And what do you do if you rule that one of the exclusionary clauses is the primary problem? So let's see, what happens? So this is a case that I had. I had a child who was 10 years old, came in with no real problems. No IQ, no emotional problems, no health problems, but they never been to school, not even for one day. So this child was, the parents kept them home. They never went to school, and they were homeschooled to some level, but they weren't really given any kind of true homeschooling education. Now they're placed in the foster care system. Where do you put them if they've never received, they don't know the basics for reading and writing? Where do you put them? If they don't have a disability, you can't put them in special ed. How do you deal with this group? So in this, just take a few minutes and write some notes within your slides where you would think and how this particular type of situation happens. And I'm going to tell you the answer right now. We didn't know what to do. It was very, very, very stressful how to deal with this child. In particular, legally, they should have been put into general ed. And at the eligibility team meeting, remembering it as a team, I was overruled that the child did not have a disability. The rest of the team said that they did, even though there was this, and so they placed them into special ed. So this, I want for you to take a look. You're going to have 4 scenarios across the next 2 pages. I want for you to take a look at them and think, when I'm doing consultation and I'm thinking about these kids and systems issues, which of these kids, so in the first scenario, you have a child who's poor and black in a school where mostly white and middle class, versus a child who's rich and black in a school that's mostly white and middle class, versus a poor black child who's with mostly other poor black children. Okay? So who does worse and who does best? Well, academically, you're probably going to see that the rich and black student in the middle class white neighborhood is going to do best academically. Social emotionally, it's probably going to be the last one, the poor black student with other poor black individuals, right? And who's going to fare the worst is the poor black student in the white school. So this is the kind of thing, so that when you're thinking about what kind of issues is a child having, is it something within the child or within the system? How can I take this system for this child who's poor and black in a school with mostly white and middle class students? How do I provide supports? Because this is not a disability, this is a consultation issue. So I want for you just to go through, and first, this assignment really is just identify which kids you think are going to do better academically and emotionally, and which ones are going to do worse. So you have your second scenario, just kind of put in your notes which group you think it is, and then you have two others.